It's Paul Roos here from Performance by Design, and welcome to the Culture Couch. My partner in crime, Jared Murphy. G'day, Murph.
G'day, Roosy. How are you?
And the gentleman to your right, very exciting. Every Culture Couch is good, but I'm really looking forward to this one. This is big. This is big. And before we introduce my man Andrew Gazey, let's go through his resume, which is reasonably impressive, I might add. 22 seasons in the NBL with the Melbourne Tigers. MVP 7 times, scoring title 14 times. Some might say because he never passed the ball, but we'll touch on that. 2 NBL championships, all NBL first team 15 years in a row, and of course the national team 5 Olympics. I think there's only 3 or 4 other people to have done that in basketball. Oscar Schmidt from memory was one.
Yeah, he's one. There might be a couple, but
more. Yep.
Not from me.
And a flag bearer, which was we'll touch on that as well. FIBA Hall of Fame, and named as one of the top 50 basketballers of all time by FIBA, which is pretty impressive. Went to college at Seton Hall, and I really want to explore that because most Australians don't know how big college basketball is, and made the final game, which was incredible performance. San Antonio Spurs for the championship, which was great, and Gazey and I connected that year, which was even better, and then went on to the coaching career with the Seaball, first of all, and then with the Sydney Kings. So, mate, welcome to the Culture Couch. One of the things I want to touch on before we get into the leadership and culture, because one of the things Murph and I get often asked about, how do you form habits? And probably people don't really understand a lot about the 10,000 hours. There's a theory around that. There's a great book called Bounce.
Yep.
But you're a living, breathing example of that. So tell us a bit about your background growing up at the Albert Park Basketball Stadium, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, I had a privileged upbringing as far as sport is concerned because my dad was the general manager of what then was called the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association. And back in the late 50s, there was these 3 old Army warehouse storage facilities that were converted into sport. And one of them was basketball. Right next to the basketball stadium was badminton, and then there was table tennis. And in their conversion, basketball in their wisdom, they built a little manager's residence. And my dad, his primary responsibility was trying to expand the game and run this facility. So from the time I was born to the time I was about 13 or 14, I had a 9-court basketball stadium as my backyard, and combined that with the guidance that my dad was able to provide me, being a 3-time Olympian as a player and 4-time Olympic coach, it gave me a profound advantage over my peers. And when you're talking about habits, I was fortunate enough that he was able to instill in me those very significant work habits in regards to developing your skills and developing your fundamentals. Yeah,
and there's a real technical component, and I mean, you certainly picked that up incredibly well. I mean, I played a lot of basketball as a kid and have watched you consistently, and still would claim that technically you're as good a shooter as anyone in the world, which is hopefully take that as a compliment. But there's also the leadership component. Having your dad that was an Olympian as a player and a coach, take me through that from a young boy. What were you learning from him that perhaps you didn't realise at the time, because often you don't when you're a young kid, but how was that? You know, a legend of the game, a coach of the game, you're his son. Did you listen, and what did you learn?
Well, he never actually started coaching me in a team environment until I was 15, just when I was starting senior basketball, because I started very young. Prior to that, I had a number of different junior coaches, and he was still coaching at the time. So I honestly can't remember him coming and watching me play. Right. From the time I first started when I was 6 or 7 until I was 14 or 15. Now, I'm sure there would have been, but I can't recall it. So he didn't see a lot of me in that team settings. But, of course, he was there when I was shooting hoops and teaching me the footwork and the fundamentals. He was there through that. But as I reflect back on it, I think the biggest asset that he gave me was not so much to do with the fundamentals of the game, more to do with the approach to the game, about keeping the game in perspective, the sacrifices you need to make in order to get to the highest level, and understanding the relationships you have to build in a team sport to have individual success and be able to contribute individually. Those types of themes were I think, the biggest thing I got out of the teachings that he gave me in those formative years.
And so I was going to say, so if your dad didn't start coaching you till you were 15, who was the influential coach in your junior years.
Yeah.
that
Well,
sort
he
of-
was there coaching, but just not in that team setting. So in those team situations, it was my local under 12 coach was Ron Anderson. So Ron Anderson is a guy that coached me under 12s and 14s, and he was very specific on how he wanted the game to be played. And I think for me, I was lucky to be, at a very, very early age, introduced to a system-based way in which to play the game.
Yep.
These days, although it's a team sport, from a very early age, they have a real strong influence or concentration on the fundamentals, which are vital, but also how in which you create with the ball. When I was very young, there was a very equal proportion given to what you do with the ball as well as what you do without the ball, and how in which that incorporates into a team system. That is not as, in my judgment anyway, not as specific and not as focused as it was when I was growing up. And I honestly think it's to the detriment. But there's no right or wrong way. There's great outcomes that have been produced for a variety of different ways of teaching. But certainly from my perspective, I strongly have a strong recommendation to expose kids at a very early age to complex systems, and they'll continue to develop individually.
And were there any other kids coming through with you that went on to?
Yeah.
Yep.
I came through a generation where the game was starting to explode, and we were, I think, getting a lot more teaching, a lot more opportunity at a young age, as compared to those that become before me. And Ruzi was part of that. He was a year or two ahead of me, but he came through the
He wouldn't have been in the top squads, though, would he?
He certainly was. He played state representative for Victoria,
No, he keeps telling
and came through at. And I think that's another thing that through that period, and certainly nowadays with a lot of sports from a young age, they keep that focus right on a specific sport. I still strongly recommend through those formative years diversity in different sports. And Ruzi did a lot. I had, because the environment I grew up is, I got to experiment with all those different sports that I was surrounded by. So I think that there is some merit in exploring all different options, even though you might still have a focus and your long-term goal is with a one particular sport. Through those formative years, when you're from the time you're 7 to 14, 15, I'm a very strong advocate for exploring a variety of different sports.
And I think it's a good point, Gazey, because if you look at some of the cross-sport players, Scotty Pendlebury had an AIS scholarship.
Very good
went on to
basketball
become
player.
a great footballer.
Yep.
Paddy Mills, most people won't know this, but Paddy Mills won the under-16 medal at the AFL Championships in Canberra, I think it was, and went on to play basketball. Ben Simmons is a comp best and fairest winner in under-12s, I think, for Beverly Hills Footy Club.
Yeah.
So I 100% agree. It's the ability to do multiple sports, which probably doesn't exist much anymore. But I want to shift gears, because one country that typically doesn't do it is America. And you went over probably at the right age, because you'd had that mix of good sports, different coaching, and then get into a system which is very much about education and just basketball. That's at Seton Hall. Take us through that time in your life.
Yeah, well, I actually went to Seton Hall because of my focus and goal of playing for Australia. My parents also instilled at me at a very, very young age the requirement to get an education. So getting an education and sport were hand in hand, and the other stuff, well, that's if there's a little bit of time left over, all the very best to you. But because of, at a young age, playing for the Australian team, going overseas quite a bit, I missed a lot of school at the end of high school. So I started a physical education degree at Victoria University. Back then it was called Footscray
Institute of Technology.
That's right. So it's changed their name since. Now it's a 3-year degree. It took me 11 years to finish. Now you only get 10 years to finish. Now,
Well, I went there and didn't finish.
well, hopefully that's not a reflection of my IQ, but just more the circumstances that was around me and the time that I could allocate to it. So I had this opportunity at Seton Hall, and for me, equally proportional was a chance to go and play at a really, really high level of basketball, but also a chance in our off-season here to get a few more credits so I could get through. And played at Seton Hall, big conference, Big East Conference, and small school, but a very famous coach in PJ Carlesimo went on to become a very famous coach. And I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. I was older, 23 years of age, and it was straight after my second Olympic Games at Seoul, and went there and was part of a team that went through to the championship game, the NCAA tournament. There's over 300 Division I teams, 64 of them get invited to the tournament at the end. We went through and outside to the championship game and lost in overtime by one point to the University of Michigan, and dare I say it, in one of the most horrific officiating decisions in the history of the sport. But we won't get into that now because I'll do me head in.
And I think, to put it in perspective, I think from memory there's 37,000 or something there.
Yeah.
So it was 37,000 people at a basketball game, a college basketball game. So it's as big as it gets. Tell us about studying and playing basketball, though, from a real leadership and culture, and PJ Carlesimo, who went on and coached in the NBA. Tell us about his philosophies, but throwing it all in together, what was that like, culture, leadership, dealing with all those sort of things as a 23-year-old? Yeah,
well, it's a little easier for me because I was a lot more mature and seen a lot of things and travelled internationally. So you had this broader education beyond just your official education. And in the college system, it is a requirement to meet certain expectations with your studies. If you don't meet those expectations, you are not allowed to play. So they devote a lot of resources with tuition, making sure that you get extra help to get through. Now, fortunately, I was okay. I was managing my studies okay, but it's it's one of the things when you look at this very elite profession. It's a billion-dollar industry with student athletes, and that's been one of the big arguments that's been going on recently to say, well, you're exploiting these kids. They generate a whole bunch of revenue. Yeah, they get an education, but you're earning billions of dollars and none of it's going back to the kids. That's another issue. But it is, and I mention it on the basis is to say that there are a lot of things that these really elite athletes need to consider to whether or not they should go to college. And it's evolved to a point now where even here in Australia, the last few years, we've had some of the top high school basketball players choose to come to Australia because, for a variety of different reasons, but one of them is because you're saying, well, I'm going to use my skills, and yes, I'll might get an education, but I'm not getting financially compensated for it. So those have been ongoing issues that date back to even when I was there, but more profound more recently. But it's an interesting, when you talk about leadership, the coach's role in that, because they are paid, and they are paid large amounts of money in order to run their programs. And back then, it was very dictatorial type approach in the way in which they would coach and teach. I think it's evolved in the last 20 years, but back then, when I was there in 1989, it was the norm. It was the norm for coaches to want to have complete control because there was so much at stake as far as their jobs.
So in terms of developing your own personal leadership, when you go into a team like that, how do you impact the group? Like, do you just go and play, or do you build relationships?
It's a fine line, and I took the attitude when I was going there, and like I said, it was easier for me because I was a lot older. But I took the attitude is I'm here to get an education, to help with my education. I'm here to learn. And I went in there very open-minded about what my role would be. And I think a lot of the kids that have come through high school, the sport is their ticket to better things. Yeah, they're getting educated, but ultimately their desire is to become a professional athlete. So you've got a lot of different elements pulling at these kids and influences on these kids about, well, what really is important. And as I said, the greatest advantage that I had, I went in there to say, well, a lot of these players have been there. This is their 4th year with the team because you get 4 years of eligibility. And I was there to be helpful, to help them. I wasn't on my own agenda. And I think without that, it would have been very difficult for me to be accepted by this very experienced team, relatively experienced team, and embraced as an international player. So I think that just comes from a level of maturity that I had at the time, and an advantage of being a little bit older going into that situation.
Did they embrace you at the start, or because it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Because for those that don't know much about the college system, it is. It's they live, eat, breathe basketball.
Yeah.
It's like their ticket out of it. So you're an Aussie guy that's come, and obviously you played in the Olympics, so I suspect a lot of them would know who you were. But how was that early dynamic?
It was, you go through that feeling out process, but because the coaches are so influential and they really set the agenda and the tone and for want of a better word, the culture of the group, it's not something that the players necessarily have a direct influence on. Now, naturally, with your personality and the dynamics of a team, those things will filter through. But as far as the standards, the expectations, it was set by the coach.
Yep.
And because of that, it's easier for other players to come in because there is a well-entrenched, established understanding about how you treat your teammate, regardless of where they come. Now, of course, we all know that's been in team sport. There's that underlying personality issues that you've got to address, but it was a lot easier to come in because of those conditions that were set by the coach.
And also, I mean, I went down to Fitzroy from Donvale, and all the players I went with either were from my area or from similar areas. Now, you started in the NBL in an era of a lot of these college athletes didn't play in America. They came to Australia, so brought that American mentality, American culture. So take us through that from a young kid from Albert Park who turns up at Melbourne Tigers, and I think from memory it's still 2 Americans back then, but they were very, very influential Americans, very big personalities, very talented. So from a culture point of view, how was that dynamic?
What helped in making that transition, because I'd been around American players, my first couple of years of senior basketball, they didn't have limitations on imports. So again, when I look back at my own personal opportunities, a lot of it was based on the very first senior team that I played with. My teammates were Alan Westover, Brian Gorgon, Bruce Palmer, and another guy called Hugh Hobus. All 4 Americans that had played at the highest level of collegiate basketball, and subsequently 2 of them have gone on to be 2 of the greatest coaches Australia has ever seen, in Bruce Palmer and Brian Gorgon. Oh, 3 of them actually, and Alan Westover. So I had those influences on me at an early age. That helps. It helps develop your skills, but it also helps in those other peripheral things about keeping the game in perspective, understanding that the joy you need to get out of the game, all those things. They were great teachers for that and were able to help me. And also, I think, when you look at all the other teams and the sport in general, profound influence from the Americans. But if you go back even before that, before the influences, and you look at the history and the way the sport has evolved here in Australia, it was the Lithuanians, it was the Greeks, it was the Italians. That immigration that was coming on during the 40s, 50s and 60s, and those people that had experienced basketball in their own countries and brought that to this country, they had a profound influence on the game and the culture of the game here in Australia.
What stood out for you in what they brought that was potentially different to what you grew up with and what you were used to?
With the Americans?
With the Americans.
Well, I think what it was a different method of practicing as well. Here in Australia, we were amateurs. And you understood that, okay, you might be training twice a week and you'll go out and you'll goof around by yourself, and there was that. This is not a profession. We're never going to make money out of this, so we concentrate on it. We're doing this purely for fun. But what it did back then, it really did separate those that were in it for the right reasons, because you were never going to make a dime out of it.
Yeah.
But what the Americans that had come over to Australia, they'd come through programs since high school where they're training 6 days a week, a couple hours a day. And in order to get to their level, it quickly became apparent that if you don't put the time in, you're not going to be able to compete with them. And it's one of the big arguments we're talking about Americans and opportunities for Australians. And one of the arguments is that, well, we needed restrictions because we were denying Australians the opportunity to play. Now, my experience is the contrary to that. Is to say, I don't care where they come from. I played with 4 imports. In order for me to get a game and get court time, I had no choice but to get better. If I didn't become as good as them, I was never going to get to play. So they, I think, lifted me to their standards. Whereas if those import restrictions had been in place when I was there, there would only be 2 of them. So I would have been elevated a lot quicker and wouldn't have been surrounded by that same level of talent. So, yeah, I understand there's a balance in there somewhere, but I think that we get so caught up here in Australia on putting in place restrictions rather than saying, just let talent prevail. I don't care where they're from. If they are good enough, get better. That's the answer. If you want to play, get better. And don't play to the lowest common denominator. Try and strive yourself and bring in better talent and get better to reach those standards.
And the Tigers went on to become a reasonable team?
Tigers have would have, I think, if you go back to the extended history. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these teams that we see in the NBL, they don't date back to 1931 when the Tigers were first came into play. So if you date it back to them, it's unquestionably the most successful club in the history of Australian basketball. But I understand since the NBL started back in 1979, and most people just their history starts from there because they see that as the elite competition. And that is significant. But if you take a broader view of it all, the Melbourne Tigers, with their influences, with 2 of the pioneers of the sport in Ken Watson and Lindsay Gazey, the founders of basketball in this country, being involved in that club, they had very influential characters to be able to develop the sport.
And it was also, I guess, the development of basketball in a halcyon time in Australia. Like I remember, it grew like it was the big thing to do on the weekend, go to a basketball game. I remember going to watch you guys play. It was fantastic. And it had a real buzz around it, didn't it?
Well, it started to become professional. Like I said, when I was at high school and even when I was 18 or 19, I went to my first Olympics. The prospect of me becoming a full-time professional, it still wasn't there, but it was a very rapid rise. So from the time of 84 in particular, so from about 84 to 90, the sport became highly professional. And by the late 80s, we had full-time athletes. So it was very quick from that rank amateur status to where players could generate an income from it.
Yeah, that's fine.
You've got an incredible journey, again, from a culture and leadership point of view, because we've already talked about your junior stuff. We've talked about Seton Hall. We've talked about the Tigers. But then you go on, as you said, to play for Australia. So suddenly you've got these 18 to 22-year-olds that are college players. You've got this influx of Americans coming to Australia. And now you've got the cream of Australian basketball all coming together. Tell us about that dynamic.
It is. And I think when I first started playing with the senior team was 1983. And the thing, even back then, even when you're talking about guys that were amateurs, even the Australian team were all amateurs. Over the years, but what preceded that had established a culture. Now, whether that was just the culture of Australia being then filtering down to the actual sport, but I think that there was more to it. I think there was actually a culture in that group. Despite from year to year, there was changes in personnel, sometimes significant changes in personnel. There still was this underlying culture about the expectations of what it requires to play for Australia, the behaviours of what is expected of you when you play for Australia. Those things were still well and truly in place. And although we evolve and the sport evolves, I still think fundamentally many of those things are still there with the Australian team.
Yeah.
Despite completely different generation, completely different personnel, but they are still there because there is that legacy that continues on and carries through.
So how old were you when you first were picked in the Australian squad?
When I first was in a squad,
in the senior squad, sorry.
When I actually went to an Australian team camp when I was 16 years of age.
So when you walk in there, you look around.
Yeah.
How was that, and who were the people that sort of guided you and picked you up?
Yeah, it was Phil Smythe. It was Larry Senstock. It was Ray Borner was part of the team. It was Ian Davies, Wayne Carroll. Yeah. These types of guys have been there. And
what did you learn off them?
Well, it was almost you're learning those things that I'm sure that the experience that they had and learnt from others. And that is an expectation of your behaviour, an understanding of the privilege of playing for Australia, keeping the game in perspective and saying, yep, we're trying to compete and we take great pride in pulling on a green and gold jersey, but if we're not having fun, because we're amateurs, if you're not having fun, then it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to enjoy this experience as much as you should and be able to get the outcome, and that is a performance which you need to achieve without it if you're not having fun. So these are the things that I learnt from these guys. Yep. You quite often, when I first went in there, it was all about putting the ball in the hole. It's all about sliding your feet on deep. It's all about learning the fundamentals. But pretty quickly, through that education that you get from these guys, you understand that there's more to it than that. It's this relationship I've got to build. It's a respect for where you've come from that might be vastly different from where I've come from. It's gaining an understanding about what that is. And if you don't have that, or that is ignored, then you'll either be ostracised or you're not going to get the outcome that you're looking for.
And did they give you a spray? Like, did they, if you weren't doing the right thing?
Some of the greatest, and remember, combine this, I'm the coach's son as well. So in all my time in basketball, the Australian Boomers camps that I went to from 1982 to up to about 1987 were the most brutal, physically brutal camps that I've ever been to, because these are guys that they're competing for a spot to pull on a green and gold jersey and get to the Olympics. It wasn't about the money. There was no money. It was about that's the ticket.
Pinnacle,
And they were prepared to do whatever it takes in order to get there. So that the level of commitment and fierce competitiveness was as high as I've ever seen and ever been a part of.
You can still see it in his face.
It was almost frightening. You're almost a bit scared to go on the court because you've got a squad of 22 guys and the skill level was nowhere near what it is today. And in order for us, Australia, to compete, we didn't have the great athletes or the big guys. We got it through being just fierce, determined, mangy, ruthless competitors more than skill. And they were the characteristics that we had to have because we didn't have the size that were actually encouraged and recruited, because you're not going to compete with a 7 foot. We had Larry Senstock at 6'6", was a starting centre on one of our teams going up against 7'1" guys. You got to find a way to compete.
With your journey, which is sort of similar in years to mine through footy, and listening to you talk, it's so similar, the culture. When did you notice that sort of slight shift from top-down coach to players, relationships? When did you notice that in? For me, it probably didn't happen until late even right at the very end of my career, it sort of started to happen. When did it happen for you in basketball?
Well, I noticed there was always a gradual change, but I was lucky playing for my dad. My dad, I think, is more, his approach to the game was probably a little bit more in tune to what it is today than back then, albeit in a different era. So there is those caveats around it, but very open, not dictatorial, didn't raise his voice all that much, you know, more structurally building relationships. He was probably more in tune to that. But the most profound changes that I think that you're referring to actually came after my career. And when we went into coaching and understanding how and which you've got to build those relationships beyond the skill. The skill stuff and the training, that's the easy part. That is the real easy part. But it's those other stuff that in honesty, I had trouble with, and that's why, you know, you guys were really helpful for me in my coaching journey, because I was, you know, put my hand up and say, well, we're all different, and I was probably more in tune to the old ways in regards to open, happy to listen, but you know, the experiences that these guys are having outside of basketball, I was sort of, well, that's their business. Well, in many instances, it's not. You've got to be that father figure as well as being their coach. And it's not that I didn't want to do that, it's just that it was something that I probably wasn't as acutely aware of the requirements of it when I was coaching.
It's a great segue into the coaching, Murph, isn't it? Because we were fortunate to work with Gazey and probably firstly, take us through the decision to coach, because you were probably one of those guys that most people thought were pretty comfortable doing the media and, you know, you'd had this fantastic career and you and I were on the High Performance Basketball Commission and, you know, you're probably not necessarily seen as a coach. Now, that's not a bad thing. It was more just that's the way it was. So you've already expressed some of the difficulties, which we'll touch on, but what was the decision-making process in taking the position?
Yeah, well, for me, it was one that when I finished playing, there was a lot of opportunities to get involved in senior coaching straight away. But I thought the pathway to that and trying to discover whether is this something you really want to do anyway was starting off the grassroots. So starting off at junior basketball, coaching there, graduating into senior basketball and doing bits and pieces there. And I was absolutely happily content doing that. And then you've got these competitive desires, and you've also got a belief in your own ability. We've all got egos, whether some of them are expressed differently, but I strongly believe that I can provide an opportunity for a team and for players that will enable them to have fun, have success, and help with their growth. Now, that's what I truly believe. If you probably ask some of my players, whether it's the Kings or the juniors, there's always going to be some that may not necessarily agree with that because of different approaches to the game, and the game can be played in a variety of different ways. But I stand firm within my own mind that these are the fundamentals that I can help provide that give those opportunities. So it was just a thing where opportunity, the right time, and never really lost that desire. So I went ahead and went on to the senior coaching ranks, and great experience. Loved it, learnt so much. Went in there understanding that there's some areas that clearly I was not proficient at that I needed help with. And through that experience, come out the other end that feel way more prepared than when I went into it, and feel that you learn from it and you're always better off.
So what did you learn even about yourself in that process? Because we had a great year. Like it was.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
With Gazey and Leonard and Luke and Bogut and it was good fun, and we won some games, we lost some games, we won and ended up doing really well. What did you learn about probably yourself in that process? I reckon it's really interesting.
Well, the biggest thing for me was how in which you get others to buy into your system. in basketball, there is a million ways. It's infinite, not a million. There is infinite ways in which you can devise a system and put together a program. And I'm talking about structurally, about offenses, defenses, the X's and O's, and really no right or wrong way.
Yeah.
Yep.
And a lot of it comes down to the coach's philosophy and either recruiting those that fit that philosophy or being able to get others to buy into your philosophy. And the biggest challenge was that. To give them an understanding of how things should be done. They will go into it, and they've all come. And we had a real veteran group.
Yeah, we did.
They've had a vast array of experiences, and they would have an idea in their own heads about, well, this is how you're supposed to train.
Yep.
This is how I'm supposed to get better. This is the offense that's going to suit the team and me better. In their own heads, they all have a coach's mentality about how everything should be done. And when you've got all these different very appropriate methods of doing things and getting them all to say, well, you know what, might have to think a little bit differently here. How in which we teach skills. Does it always need to be done, or should there be a priority on the individual stuff, or can that individual stuff be done in a collective environment? How do you get someone that believes this is the only way I'm going to get better to do it the way I think it should be better? And how you communicate those things are the things that present the biggest challenges, and the things that I learn about myself to think that, not that it was going to be easy, but to think, well, surely they're going to buy into that. Surely that's just automatic. It ain't automatic. It's not.
There was never a shortage of opinions, was there, Gazey?
No, and
which is great.
And we encourage them. We absolutely encourage them.
It was really good.
And that in itself, I think, is big, is to say, how much do you encourage that?
Yeah.
How much do you...
What do you give and what do you take?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's a judgment you've got to figure out, to say, well, how much do you need to say, no, we've had the discussion, that's it. Or, no, I don't even want to have the discussion because we're not going down that path. This is the path we're going down. So it's all those things, the balance that you guys have seen it a lot, to say that it's one of those things you figure out, and as I said, I'll be better prepared to make those judgments now than what it was then. But you quite often only know in hindsight than having I don't think there's a foolproof way to say that this is do this, and this, and it's guaranteed.
And I think the thing that we try and get across, Gazey, is leadership's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah.
I think there's this perception, I'm not saying you perceived it yourself, but there is this perception, I can do it. It's sort of like, no problems. Then it's not until you get there, then you realise all the complexities of it.
Yeah.
And what I would say, working with you, which was fantastic, you were prepared to have the conversation. And that's what we would say, Murph, wouldn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
Have the conversation.
It is.
That was the best thing in my time working with the Kings.
Yeah.
And your self-awareness to say, well, I probably don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Ruzi, Murph, I'll hand it over to you. We had some of the best sessions, Murph, I think, through that process.
We did. And I tell you, one time you get in it, and in the heat of the moment and in the battle of it all, and you're going through it, and I just spoke about those judgments you've got to make.
Yep.
And there was one time Murph came to me, and he had a view about what should happen, and I had a completely, given the current situation, I had a completely different view, and I had to carry on like a 2-year-old to say, I say that figuratively, not literally, but I really got to a point to say, I've listened, I've done it, but this is how it has to be. Now, in hindsight, in the clear light of day, when your emotions aren't there, there's a rational way that you say there was nothing wrong with a different view at all. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, but that's coaching, isn't it? At the end of the day, you have to make a decision based on the information you've got and where you're at that moment. And that's the, I guess, the difficult part of leadership is you got opinions coming from, particularly in that
Yeah.
team. They were
Yeah.
so experienced coming in
an
from
older,
everywhere.
an older team. I mean,
Yeah.
I was probably a bit fortunate starting off with a younger team that was sort of ready to sit and listen.
You can mould them a little bit.
So you can sort of, they come along on the journey with you.
Yeah.
The team that you had were like, well, you tell us the journey. Well, no, I'm not sure I agree with that. So it was a fascinating, but it's going to be good for the viewers. Because a really good point, I think your self-awareness is great. Your ability to articulate, I'm better prepared now. What are the two things maybe you do differently? Or what are the main takeaways that you would now go, I'm way more confident to do it now? What were the technicalities around that?
Well, strangely, and it might seem like a contradiction, but I would go in there with a more not authoritarian, but a more narrow idea of I don't care. This is how we're going to do it. Now, there is scope in that, of course. There's always scope, and you've always taken the feedback. And I think if you don't do that, that's old. You know, you're going to struggle. But I think now that I'd narrow that.
And you're talking more from the strategic point of view, the game plan type point of view? Both,
Both. So I'm narrowing that to say, this is the way I want to play.
Yeah.
And rather than being more flexible and forgiving on certain things, to say, well, I somehow or other I've got to convince you that this is it. Yeah. Somehow or other. And again, I keep emphasising you do need scope. I don't think you can just...
But I think that would be consistent with what we would see as well. I don't think you... Because what I learned from Sydney, I couldn't have done the Melbourne job had I not done it.
Yeah.
So when I went into Sydney, I was really narrow in how I wanted to play.
Right.
So there was not a lot of grey area.
Yeah.
And I think probably with Murph, you jump in too, probably that was an area that we thought maybe you do need to get better, and that maybe you really need to tighten up because you had those personalities and you were trying to go, well, I've got to look after him, I've got to look after
100%.
him.
Yep.
So that's probably, just so we're clear on what, because I reckon it's a really good point.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And you're saying, well, don't try and be everything to everyone.
All things to everyone.
Exactly.
You've got to, and you know what? You're going to have some difficult conversations in order to achieve that.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's difficult to manage it. And I think it's probably not a great analogy, but in that last year where we finished 18-10, we had the equal top win-loss record of anyone. But through it all, because we were doing that thing, all the different things, and trying to juggle different personalities and not narrowing the focus, there was an element of halfway through it was we got to land the plane. It wasn't about winning the championship. We just got to land this plane. We've got a lot of turbulence now, but just land it and put it on the tarmac and land this plane where we try safely without the minimal amount of damage we could possibly do.
But in the end, it was like everyone came together.
Well, it did, and it didn't. I think, in hindsight, the way we did it, I thought we managed what could have been a very, very explosive situation.
Yeah,
very well.
I thought we managed it well. Now, that might have been through good luck rather than good planning, whatever it was, but I thought we did. I think if you asked a lot of the players, they would not agree.
I think you're underselling yourself there. I think it wasn't good luck. It wasn't good luck.
Well, to put a full stop on that, we spoke to a coach from another club that couldn't believe you achieved what you achieved with those personalities. So and I'm not going to give away any. But we spoke to another coach and said, I'm staggered that they got to where they got to.
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost we were lucky we had incredible talent.
Yeah,
we had really,
definitely.
really good talent.
Yeah,
and how in which we were gelling. You guys played a part in that, and but it's not how you should have when you've got all that talent, because of some of the shortcomings in our decision making, like I said, that you learn from, that we were in a situation about landing the plane, not thinking about the joy this is, and not thinking about winning a championship was always the goal, but because we're dealing with the minutiae of all these other issues, it takes your focus away from it.
But I think to that, Gazey, because again, for the viewers, I think it's a really good point. You have to address it.
Yeah.
You can't just let it slide.
No.
Because if you let it slide, the plane crashes.
Correct.
The plane just crashes. You know.
Like I said, it's maybe not a great...
No, but you're right.
Yeah.
It's a really good point, because I don't want people to think out there that, maybe I've just got to let it go. And a lot of corporations do. They just let it go. They just sweep it under the carpet and hope it goes away.
It
doesn't
doesn't
go
go
away.
Yeah.
And it turns into a mess in some way, shape or form.
Yeah.
So the fact that you addressed it, and I think the other thing too is, let's be clear, in a basketball team, there's 5 players on the court.
Yep.
So with the personalities, strong personalities, it's a high percentage of the team that you've got to deal with. So Murph and I would both say the way you handled the situation was really, really good.
Well,
We didn't sweep it under the carpet. We dealt with it head on. And I think you're right. The players did come together and had a successful
we got
season.
through some very heavy turbulence.
well, there was, but
it's
yeah,
good.
it's you learn from that,
Yeah.
and you understand. Also beyond that, beyond with that, and you say, well, how do you avoid that again?
Yes.
Or how do you not maybe avoid it? But you don't want to avoid it, but how do you manage it better?
yeah.
I think a lot of it also happens. What happens beforehand too?
Yeah.
In understanding a more deep investigation into the personalities.
Yeah.
To make sure, because each and every one of them, great guys.
It's just a team, isn't it?
But sometimes, you just get those clashes, and you say, well, maybe we could have managed that a little bit better.
There's lots of research now, Gazey, where bringing talented kids through and moulding them, like you said when you came into the Australian basketball team, is a better way of doing it than bringing in experienced, talented guys from all over the place. They've already got their own habits. They've already got their own cultures, their own belief systems. Trying to push them in together can be quite difficult.
Yeah.
Well, you look at the AFL with, Hawthorn, Clarko did it with a young team. Bomber Thompson, young team. When I took over at Sydney, it was sort of a youngish team.
Even from a corporate perspective, really, the Jim Collins stuff, where we're developing leaders through and into the culture that you want, as opposed to
100%.
just bringing in the
Star
hero
player
leader
and
dropping them in.
Great point. Mate, remiss of us not to finish on the NBA because of two points, because of the last dance.
Yep.
But in fact, you've won a championship with the Spurs, which are not arguably, I'm reading this book at the moment called The Captain's Choice, I think it's called.
Right.
And he did an enormous amount of research, incredible research on the best teams in the world.
Yep.
And the Spurs were one of them.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Spurs culture, and I might ask 2 questions in one. Tell us about the Spurs culture, the NBA, and then your thoughts on the last dance.
Yeah, the Spurs Cult, I was there during those formative years of Greg Popovich, and I was lucky enough to be with that group that started David Robinson, Tim Duncan, Steve Kerr, Sean Elliott, Mario Elie. The list goes on. That was a really talented team. But Greg Popovich, he wasn't the Greg Popovich now. He hadn't won a championship back then. But the thing that getting that first-hand experience with Greg Popovich, who has been the driver of that culture, is that there is a fundamental element of the players that recruit is that you can't take yourself too seriously. Yep. You've got to be able to laugh at yourself, and you've got to be able to keep the game in perspective. Yep. And if you don't fit it, you want talent, but if you don't have those characteristics, you're not probably going to fit the Spurs program. Now,
pausing on that, Gazey, because I reckon it's really important to Jared's point before about talent versus behaviours. Pop was almost the pioneer of the behaviours before talent. Not to say the players weren't talent like Manu and
Tony Parker,
et cetera, but it was very much around character, wasn't it?
Character, absolutely. In many essence, you could even say that character trumps talent.
Yes.
You need talent, but Pop was always this sort of guy to say, well, if you've got those other characteristics, there's enough talent out there that you're going to be able to build a collective that will be more successful than the individual. Now, what he was able to do is have the absolute uber elite talent, that bought in
good
to those team concepts about sharing, about providing an environment where you care for each other. Pop gets to know everything about his players. Their background, very sympathetic to some of the challenges that the individuals might have faced. And make no mistake about it, he is a competitive beast. And he doesn't tolerate a fool and is very overt. But what he is, he's egalitarian in his way in which he coaches.
Yep.
He will coach and coached Tim Duncan and David Robinson the same way he would coach the 15th guy on the roster in regards to the expectations and the culture. So, and I think that helps with that middle tier to say, well, he's asking me to do some things, but he's not compromising and asking those or turning a blind eye to what he expects of
consistency.
The big guy, the more talented, influential players. And he was able to do it where the game was being predicated on individual talent, ISO ball, this. He was able to value passing, value ball movement, and value sharing as much as he did that individual talent.
Which is, I think, why they endured for so long. Wasn't because it almost sounds silly as it sounds. That team concept became unique. It's even more unique now. Isn't it?
Everyone's trying to emulate it, and some more so than others. But it is difficult because the nature of the game, the business of the sport these days, what it means to the individuals, it is a huge challenge that they're facing because there's so much money involved.
And also, fundamentally, I don't think everybody understands it so clearly. So we can try and copy coaches, in this case Pop, but not everyone will be able to replicate how he recruited, how he coached, how he developed, how he treats them.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because my dad used to talk about, and you go to these leadership seminars, and he talks about a common phrase which is used is world's best practice. Let's look at world's best practice and emulate it. And he used to, when he used to talk to it, he said, well, that's good, and you should. You absolutely got to look at it. But if you try and replicate what's exactly what someone else has done, you've got a chance to get close, but you're never ever going to get to be identical to that. You have to take all that and create your own
100%
world's best practice. So don't just look at someone else and say, that is the way it can be done. Because if you don't know, and it gets to your point, the intricacies and the nuances to what created that, and you just look at some of the fundamentals that they do and say, well, we replicate that, that's world best practice. Well, not always. And you're not probably going to get to that same level if all we're doing is trying to do that. It's
also the lack of belief in it too. You don't really believe in it. It's that passion that drives great teams. If you don't really believe in it, if someone tells you got to do it because it seems like it's working for them, it's very hard over the course of 82 games in the NBA, 22 games in the AFL, NBL, etc., etc. I mean, you're really well placed to talk about The Last Dance, and if you haven't seen it, I always say you've got to watch it, not just from a sporting point of view, but from a leadership point of view, with your background, which we've touched on in college sport and the NBA and NBL and coaching, and your association with Luke Longley as well, who was with the Chicago Bulls. What was your take on it? What were some of the key takeaways that you took out of it?
Well, the first one is it reinforced my belief that Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player ever. That's the first one. The second one is, and I looked at it through a different lens now than what I would have when I was playing, because you understand the challenges that Phil Jackson was facing as well. And I think that Phil Jackson and that group did an extraordinary job of taking these different personalities, and some of them extreme in the case of Dennis Rodman, and being able to find a way to get the outcomes that you're looking to get. And a lot of them would look at it and say, these days, and say, well, you've got Dennis Rodman who's missing practice sessions, wanting vacations in the middle of season, going away the night after a championship series loss, goes and WrestleMania in front of 20,000 people.
It was great.
And you say, well, a lot of coaches in a lot of teams would say, well, this is inappropriate, this is no good. Well, you're ignoring the fact that he's averaging 20 boards a game and he's helping us. And how you manage that in a team environment is difficult.
Yeah.
And it almost flies in the face of what we were talking about with Greg Popovich about treating everyone equal. Well, you do treat them equal, but there are some, I guess, that you've got to understand the personality type and say, if we don't agree to this, he's no good to us, and we're not going to get the outcome we're looking for.
He's
no
either
matter
in
what
or
we
he's
do.
not in. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And just on that point, like it takes so much energy to behave differently than you want to behave. So watching that, I was thinking, imagine the energy that Rodman was expending trying to conform.
Yeah.
And that's where I reckon Phil Jackson was amazing.
Yep.
He realised that, and he said, "This guy is going to explode. He's going to do something stupid if we don't let him go for 2 days, which turned into 5 days or whatever it was." But
they also had the conversation. I think that's
that's the key point.
Yeah, it was great.
Now they were lucky because they'd seen those personality traits in other teams.
Yep.
Yeah.
But they've also saw his skill.
Yep.
And before they even recruit him, they talk to Michael, they talk to Scotty, they talk to the coach. They go, listen, if you're not prepared to make some compromises here, we don't recruit him.
Yep.
But if we don't recruit him, we don't have a very important piece to our overall team skill sets that we're going to need.
Yep.
But I think it extends beyond that. I think it also extended to in this documentary, and because I've known Luke Longley for a long period of time. You also see the approach that Michael Jordan had and the expectations he had on his teammates. And who really knows? But I'm not so sure that type of personality and that leadership style would be acceptable in this, no matter how skilled you are. Now, I could be wrong because he is.
But I also think it's the combination. I reckon, and speaking to a lot of people that have said about Michael, whether it's good leadership or not good leadership, which we can all debate, but the combination of Phil Jackson and Michael Jordan.
Correct.
That's what worked.
Absolutely.
And Pippen.
And the rest
of course the others. Of course the others. But I thought one of the pivotal moments on that is that there was almost like this, he'd been grappling with himself in regards to this fierce, ruthless determination and the language that he used with his teammates to get the best out of them. Clearly the outcome, winning 6 titles, he'd look back on that and say, well, that was appropriate. But I think that there was a period, episode 7.
Episode 7, the last 5 minutes.
Where he spoke about understanding to say, well, he's gained the respect of the world and I'm sure his teammates for the way in which he conducted himself, but did he gain the love?
No.
Did he gain the friendship?
Yep.
Did he?
Yeah.
And he shed a tear when he was reflecting on that. And in his own mind, because of his competitive nature, I'm sure he still would look back and say, I'd do it all again, and probably rightfully so. But there was this epiphany moment where there is this understanding that it come at a price. There was a price
of leadership
you had to pay in order for that to happen, but he clearly walked the he walked the walk as well as talked the talk. He didn't put expectations on others which he didn't impose on himself.
Just before we leave The Last Dance, a couple of things. I don't know what Phil Jackson did when he moved on to the Lakers, but he won a number of titles. It'd be fascinating.
Another 5.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see if he coached the same way. I don't know if he did or he didn't.
Similar problem. Well, he had a bit more problems at the Lakers with Kobe and Shaq, didn't he?
Well, he did. And structurally, he ran his triangle offense. He ran his system very much the same. And you can do that because take out Michael Jordan, put in a very, very close clone in Kobe. You can do that, and you build the team around the system that he wants to implement. So it
did.
But
that wasn't the question. The question was actually going to be the role of administrators and the team. So in The Last Dance, Jerry Krause. So you sort of love him and hate him at the same. You admire him, but you wonder why did he not let them go for one more year?
The narrative in the documentary was Jerry Krause had an ego and he felt like he wasn't getting the reward for putting this team together. Yeah. Scottie Pippen, who was his greatest critic throughout a lot of it because he signed a deal that was clearly unders, and you saw Scottie almost belittling Jerry Krause during that period. But at the end of it, in the very last documentary, Scottie openly concedes that one of the greatest general managers to be able to find a way to get this team together, one of the greatest general managers in the history of the sport. But when you're going through it and you're feeling like you're underpaid and you're not being respected enough, he probably had a different view. But why Jerry Krause and the owner, Jerry Reinsdorf, didn't continue on, again, the narrative of the documentary, I don't think necessarily accurately reflects what was happening. Okay. Phil Jackson was never coming back, by the sound of things.
Pippen probably wasn't either. Yeah.
I mean, he was never, ever coming back. And they presented as if to say, well, here was Jerry Krause with this ego that he wanted to almost rebuild to say, well, one of his famous quotes, players don't win championships, general managers win championships. Now, we all know that's not true, but I think that there is some fact to that to say unless you get a general manager that can get all the pieces together, you're not going to win either.
That's probably more how important is good administration in terms of developing the culture of the team?
I think it's vital, unless they're hand in hand. Now, it might not look like it in that circumstance because towards the latter stages of it, there was a very difficult relationship with their general manager. But from the top down, and you talk about the things that you guys have touched on culture, unless the entire organisation is buying into that, you might get lucky where you might have a year. But if you're talking about sustained success, I don't think you can do that unless that everyone is unified with the objectives and the culture. Yeah. That's just my judgment.
Yeah, I think it's 100%. I mean, and for those that haven't seen it, The Last Dance is amazing, but it's probably a good point to finish on because I think when they're all together, but then when ego creeps in, isn't it? Yep. We talked to Barmy about that. Barmy was very much about as soon as the ego creeps in about, well, hang on, I want more credit than Murph and I'll a bit more than Gazey. And that seems to be what happened because there were so many good messages. I like the point, Gazey, and we talk about it all the time. Michael Jordan said, I didn't ask anyone to do anything I didn't do myself. That's what we consider role model leaders. But then the ego seemed to start to creep in and then the whole thing fell apart. But mate, incredible conversation, incredible journey.
I've got one more. Your father was enormously influenced, still is, on your life. As a coach and a father, I'm sure. Did the lines ever get blurred between being a dad and a coach? Because you spent so much time.
In my judgment, they didn't. Yeah. I think that what it was, we were very fortunate as I reflect back on it, that the personality type matched the coaching style that made it possible. I think I've seen many father-son, or I shouldn't say father-son, parent, athlete relationships that just clearly don't work. But I think because of his coaching style, very open with his approach, not the dictatorial ranter and raver, that made it easy. Without that, the evidence that I have and from what my own observations, that would be very difficult.
Okay. And I think on that, I mean, you listen to your dad and having spent a lot of time with you, I mean, the role model, we talk about role models. I mean, Lindsay Gaze and Australian basketball and the way you describe him, he was obviously a pioneer in coaches because it's very unusual for coaches back then to have an open book policy and build relationships. It was much more around top down. So the fact that you had that background as a father was just incredible. Mate, unbelievable culture couch. Fantastic, Gazey. Thanks, Murph. And we'll be back again next time.